Art has long been a safe place for the expression of emotion and feeling. This comes up very frequently when discussing art history, poring over the meaning behind each piece, and sometimes dissecting far more than the artist's original intent, than the artist ever did in their own work. For young kids, we focus primarily on the physicality of art making, but often just by age 12, we switch that focus and start encouraging students to express themselves through their work. At first, this is a rocky endeavor for many of them. It's a new thing. How do I use metaphor or analogy in my work? How can I represent a thing without drawing the thing itself? As you slide into high school and beyond, if you take art seriously, then this expression of thought and emotion is even more encouraged. I sat beside so many presentations in college, simply rolling my eyes as someone described the intention behind their poorly put together sculpture, or how they defended that dressing up for their 3D project constituted a project at all. And yet, for my naive and immature reactions, there is some heart to this, some goodness in expression, as long as it isn't just a farce to get a grade. Emotions are an integral part of art making, I would say right alongside the recording of events. These two aspects might be the whole reason to make art in the first place. My name is Zach, and welcome to episode 72 of the podcast. Today we are discussing emotions and their place in artwork, both from the side of emotions behind what the artist was making and what they put into their work, and the emotions experienced by others through that very work. As usual, I'm going to explore what I mean by the topic, then go over how this might actually affect you as an artist. Though I'm going to start adding some closing thoughts and updates at the end of each episode now, so stay tuned for that. This is potentially a big topic, and at this point, I have no idea how long it's going to go. So don't be surprised if it's short, if it's long, or if there might even be a part 2. If you like what I'm doing here, feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon linked below. Before we get started though, what about you? Do you find art making an emotional thing intrinsically? Does it trend more logically for you? Is it soothing? Emotion takes many forms for us, so let me know in the comments below. Oh, and you might have seen the piece in the background before, but this will be the full version of it, so I hope you enjoy. Well, what do I mean by emotion when it comes to art? Emotion is another one of those things that we all seem to have an intrinsic understanding of. It is the feelings we have concerning most of what it is to be human, to be alive. When it comes to our art, we sometimes feel emotions as we make it, or we make it because we are feeling a particular way. Sometimes it makes us feel better, or sometimes it just makes us feel good. Sometimes it's the opposite though, isn't it? But emotion can also be the purpose of the art, for the artist, or for the audience. It is a broad topic, and so I will be going through several different categories. But before I do, I think it pertinent to take a moment and talk about emotion versus expression. These terms are used in connection to one another frequently when it comes to art. If you express yourself in your art, you are likely embedding emotion within the piece, choosing to push a particular ideal or topic in order to elicit emotion or to communicate something specific. The fundamental difference, I think, comes down to the fact that expression is more about communication specifically. When you express yourself or an idea in a piece, there is an intention that another human being can get something out of it, that they can pull your particular intent, or something you did not intend, but allowed for. It seems that by its nature, expression is about this connection between two human beings through the piece of art. But that connection is not amorphous, at least it's not usually intended to be. If you're expressing something, you probably want the other person to pick up on that specific something. Obviously, this cannot always be the case, as art is so divergent, but the emotional side of things seems to be fundamentally different from the expressionistic side of things. Emotion can push you to make pieces in a way that communicates nothing to anyone. It can push you to use it as therapy or self-soothing. It can push you to create things that you did not intend or couldn't have imagined intending. Any of these could also be a form of self-expression or could express something to someone else. However, I think the emotion is not fundamentally linked to the expression, from its own side of things at least. That said, let's dive in. First, taking a look at the emotions innate in the artwork, then emotions pushing into the artwork, then artwork as emotional tool, and finally, emotions conjured in the viewer. So let's start off with emotions innate to the artwork. From childhood, when we first start to make art, emotion blossoms within it like tiny little sprouts. You can observe this in any elementary school classroom or dining table strewn with crayons and markers, which of course is exactly what mine looks like right now with a 5.5-year-old floating around. I thought that it was the two of us and we were taking up that space, but I've recently extricated all my artwork and all my supplies, and she has just taken over the entire dining table. Kids cannot help but draw from their emotions, and everything they do seems to be laden with them, as they themselves are just beginning to understand what it is to be human and that particular aspect of themselves. Emotions start to rise up in a natural fashion at this point in most artists. In fact, as people continue to work and mature, emotion seems to always be a natural part of the expressive act. For me, frequently it's the nostalgia that jumps out. When I look back at old work, I am immediately brought back to those moments. Now, this is not something that I intended when I put those sketchbooks together, in some cases 20 years ago, right? I wasn't drawing Goku from Dragon Ball Z with the express purpose of my 37-year-old self looking at that and going, oh my goodness, this reminds me of what it was to be a middle schooler. No, but it is an innate aspect of that work. Sometimes that innate aspect takes on the emotions of who I was at that moment, though, and that's really what I'm talking about. When I look back at middle and high school sketchbooks and I see the drawings, I am immediately connected to a younger version of myself, and it's very strange. This could be something unique about my emotions, but I've seen this in a lot of other people as well. People who look back on photos from trips, and you get that kind of sigh, that innate human, I am reconnecting with the emotions of the reality of something that happened a long time ago. I'm feeling some form of those emotions, maybe the exact same, maybe modified by time, maybe influenced by tragedy. It's hard to say. But when I look back at those old sketchbooks, I'm often taken back to feelings that I had then. Sometimes excitement for new things. Sometimes I'm reminded of the people I hung out with. Sometimes little childhood insecurities come back, and all of a sudden, at my nearly 40-year-old self, I feel this awkward feeling I felt when I was 13 and just didn't know how to fit in with anyone. And it's kind of intriguing. There's an innate emotional component that's embedded within the art, and partly because I am linked to it. But you might have noticed that this can sometimes happen even when you look at someone else's work as well. Without any intention, artwork seems to gravitate toward emotion, but embedded unintentionally by its creator and perhaps inherent within the craft itself. We can tell something about the people that made artwork, though, can we not? When you go back to the cave paintings in prehistoric Europe, though perhaps they were mostly just trying to record a particular scene, a historical event, we can tell something about those people, about the things that they found important, about the color choices that they used. Yes, of course, there are lots of facts there as well. They had access to these kinds of materials. They had access to these kinds of animals. They only had, signals and symbols in these fashions. But there's also an innate human aspect that you can touch upon. When you look at Van Gogh's work, even if you know nothing about him, you can pull out a sadness. I'm specifically thinking about his Sunflower piece, although I know that Starry Night is perhaps the most famous of his pieces. When I think about these sunflower pieces that he did, they are not these bright colors. They're kind of drab, almost as if the sunflowers are embodying some of his emotion at that moment. When I look at those, I'm filled with a sense of awe and beauty, but I'm also filled with a sense of sadness. Emotionally, at some level, I am connecting with that person. And although that will come back into aspects that we look at later, the audience pulling emotions from a thing, I can tell something about that particular artist, the emotion that they intentionally or unintentionally embedded within their work. When you look at the religious artwork of pre-Renaissance, when it seemed like no one knew how to paint or draw dogs or horses yet, when the anatomy was still getting figured out, you can tell something about the curiosity, the desire to understand and to know things. Obviously, you can tell the facts too, the things that were important to them, the stories they were trying to put down. You can tell something about those early scientists trying to understand how to represent human form and make it work in a way that was just not something that anyone had done yet. When you look at Japanese woodcuts and the symbolism that they found important, these works that came into Europe and helped inspire the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, this simplified version of replicating natural details, you learn something about those people. Artwork seems to, by its very nature, contain and inspire emotion. And whether that's intended by the artist or not, we seem to pick up on some of that. And we naturally embed that in our own work. I would encourage you to go back, take a look at some of the most recent pieces that you've done, and try to extricate the emotions from those. Not as a random audience member would, but as a newer version of you would. Take a look and try to decipher what it is that you might have unintentionally put into that piece in the way of emotion. Now next, let's take a look at emotion forced or pushed into a piece. We were just talking about the kind of unintentional, natural, embedded stuff that happens regardless of your intention. But what about when you're trying specifically to push emotion into a piece? This second category spreads its wings as the artist grows older and understands the near limitless potential of artwork itself. This is where you, as the artist, decide you have something you want to get across, and you purposefully try to do that. I ran into this a ton with my high school students, especially in AP Studio Art, which is primarily 17 and 18-year-old students, seniors here in the US, who were getting ready to head out into the world. This class was almost across the board taken by people who were finishing their last year of compulsory education. And at that point in their life, many of them had very strong feelings and emotions about the country and how it was functioning. A lot of this was happening during the pandemic. And so things were a little bit strange. You know, they were looking out and there was all kinds of stuff that they could pull in as potential data for how the world worked. And so they had strong feelings about this. They had things that they wanted to communicate, and it came out in almost all their work. You know, there was a couple exceptions. Several students were just like, I want to make a comic, or I want to explore, hands. But most of them were exploring their thoughts, their feelings, and trying to express these things emotionally in their artwork. And so they would take an idea like chaos. I want to make a painting that is inspired by the chaos that I feel in the world. And that would naturally inform all the decisions they made. They would start taking different colors and different ideas in their sketches and thinking about how are these potentially going to communicate that chaos to another human. They would explore what those shapes and colors and things meant to them. And that's a beautiful part of this, because as an artist, you can't extricate yourself entirely from how you interpret a topic. So if you want to construct a piece that inspires pain, that tells people about sadness or trauma or tragedy, you can't entirely get yourself into their shoes. You have to think about how those things resonate with you, the visual cues that are going to tip a person just like you off to that, and that's what's being communicated. And so naturally there is a piece of the artist that comes into play. But as they were thinking about how they're going to communicate this to others, they're stepping outside of themselves and they're exploring what might indicate these things to someone who is not me. And so you get this beautiful harmony, and in some cases, a really discordant harmony, where an artist is trying to figure out how they can span that gap between themselves, how they think about the world, and a person who might observe their pieces. If you've ever done political artwork, if you've ever done anything that's been satirical in nature or comic in nature, you have engaged in this. The idea that you wanted to communicate something to someone else. Maybe it was just to make them laugh. A lot of the times that I've worked on pieces that I've, just shared on Instagram or things like that, especially the small drawings. I did a series of vegetables a while back. There were these goofy kind of cartoon anthropomorphized vegetables and fruits. They were just encouraging. They're holding up signs that are saying like, you can do it, and stuff like that. Those were made with express purpose. They're trying to communicate some kind of emotion to someone else, even if it's just a little chuckle. Even if somebody just sees that and goes, well, my day's a teeny bit better now because this thing made me smile. There's intention there behind that kind of work, and that's what I was trying to communicate. In fact, my daughter recently, as she's had a couple, emotional moments where she's really upset about something, she's angry or she's sad, will often sit down and draw a piece of artwork that is a self-portrait. It's her angry or it's her sad, and then she'll come share it with us. This is not something that I ever, encouraged her to do. I didn't say like, hey, here's a method, to do this. I know that as an artist, you might think that like, well, yeah, that might, be something that she's seen before or you've told her as an idea. And no, she came up with this on her own. But it's been interesting because she's exposed to artwork and to all these supplies. And it just seemed to naturally occur to her that if I'm feeling something and I don't quite have the words to express it, maybe I can do it in a visual format. And that's the beauty of this aspect of emotion in art, is that words do communicate things really effectively. But if you're anything like me, you've probably cried more in movies and you felt more emotional when you're listening to music, and a piece of artwork can sometimes resonate with you in a totally different way than reading something or hearing words. And words have tone of voice, so you get something else there as well. But the visual medium and art in general, even if we're going to stretch this into music, communicate more than just word, written or spoken. There is something inextricably tied to the visual art forms. Maybe it's that you're engaging with more of your senses or different senses. I don't know. If there's any psychologists in the crowd, I would love to hear from you on this, because there certainly seems to be something there, but I'm not sure psychologically what's happening. I can only observe the things that I've seen in almost every human I've interacted with and say, well, this might be part of the human condition. So when you are sitting down and trying to communicate something specific in your artwork, you are tapping into this aspect. And sometimes when you look at other people's artwork, you can try to perceive that as well. Now, obviously the last category we're going to talk about is the audience pulling emotion out of the artwork. But I think there's a difference between the emotions that we as the artist get out of something and the intentional emotion put into a thing. Sometimes they connect perfectly, and we'll talk about that with Mark Rothko a little bit later. But sometimes it doesn't come out exactly right. The emotion that the artist was putting in or wants to get across to another human being isn't necessarily communicated perfectly. But you know what? That's part of the beauty here, is the fact that every human who looks at that piece of artwork is going to pull something different, potentially. And that's part of the beauty here. Well, the third category is artwork as emotional tool. This one might sound the strangest off the bat, but if you'll give me just a moment, I'll explain, and I think this will make sense. Some people, in fact, quite frequently, artists will turn to their artwork as a means of taking care of themselves. I've spent some time talking on this channel about being gracious with yourself, about artist self-care, and for a lot of people in general, this is what art is for them. I'm feeling down. I'm going to go draw. I am struggling with this aspect of work. I'm going to go draw a comic about my boss. I don't know how to understand all of the thoughts in my head. Maybe I'll sit down and draw and see if I can extricate them and pull them out. This is one that I don't tend to engage in unless things are bad. I actually had something a couple weeks ago when I was overwhelmed. We had a lot of sickness here in the house for a moment, and I was the only one who was well, taking care of the other two. I was tired. We were just coming off the holidays and all of the social anxiety and stress from that. And I had this moment where I think I went to my wife and said, like, can you take our daughter for just an hour or so? I need a little bit of time with no stimuli. And when I sat down and I started drawing, the first thing that came out was this goofy character that looked like he was barely holding back the collapse of his sanity. You know, his eyes are totally different from one another. Like one of them's maybe seizing up or, blinking uncontrollably. The hair's a little disheveled. His fingers are an absolute mess. There's a mess on the desk before him. I'll put it up here on the screen for a moment so you can see it. But ironically, getting this out on my sketchbook made me feel a little bit better. Maybe because I laughed Maybe because I did something productive, I'm not 100% sure, but getting this drawing out helped me to sort through my emotions and my feelings in that moment. And again, this only happens to me when I'm very overwhelmed, when I have way too much going and the thoughts just build up in my brain and I can no longer sort them out manually. And so I need to use another resource to do that. And for me, artwork is really good that way. I have a lot of drawings that I've done over the years that have been like this, though admittedly, I do probably more of this when it comes to writing music. Music has often been my kind of emotional standby when I am in a tough spot. But this is something I saw very frequently with my students. In fact, it wasn't all that uncommon for students to be pretty fearful of someone looking in their sketchbook for this reason specifically. I would have students who had drawn some pretty dark things. Maybe they were struggling with, some traumatic events in their life or some pretty dark thoughts, and their sketchbooks were a way to work through those things. Now, as a teacher, that's a really odd fine line because there are certain things that you could see in a student's sketchbook where you would be, required by law to report them. And it's a hard thing to do. I had stuff in my sketchbooks in high school. I'm sure that if my teachers had seen, they would have had some concerning thoughts. However, at least for me in those moments, it was simply a way of dealing with the emotions, of sifting through them, of, trying to understand them. Now, obviously, if you are in a situation where you think someone you love might be struggling with something like this, talk to them about it, approach them. If this is you, seek help. People around you care more than you think, and there are always going to be people in your life who are willing to look in on you and try to take care of you. So please, if you're struggling with those kind of things, share them. But for many artists, the art itself is a strategy to work with those things in a healthy fashion. If you're sad, you'll often go listen to sad music or watch a sad movie, but artists will often sit down and make sad art. We sift through our emotions and try to understand them by actually working with them. If we could find a way to turn them into pigment and paint them on the canvas, I think we would, and I think that would probably be beneficial for us. So emotions can sometimes come into art in that way, where they are exactly the purpose behind it for you personally. This might be artwork you never share with anyone. It might be artwork that is not for anyone. It might be your path to working through some difficult things in your life. And sometimes they're not even difficult things. You might have butterflies in your stomach and be experiencing love for the first time. And artwork can be an interesting way and a good way to get that down and to sift through those pieces. Sift through, I don't know why I've said it so many times, but it comes up in one of my songs about sifting through the pieces of what's left of a broken life. So there is a lot of different angles that you can come at this. And if this is something that you haven't tried before, I would encourage you next time that you are feeling like you've got some heightened emotions, things are tough, maybe sit down and try to work through some of it artistically. I will almost never go for realistic art when I do this because the realistic art takes so much more time and I'm often not in that emotional state or don't wish to stay in that emotional state for that amount of time. But I do a lot of goofy little comic things when I'm in that spot. The artwork that you're watching unfold in the background here is obviously not done that way. This is more whimsical, it's more fun. This is something that I did for Inktober, but was also just enjoyable to do. And will hopefully, kind of key in on my children's book once I get around to it. So not all art has to be this way, but this is an important aspect and one that I feel is worth talking about. I'd love to hear from you though, if you've ever had a sketchbook like this or done work like this where you've worked through kind of some stuff in your life emotionally in a productive manner via your artwork. I'd love to hear about that. It might be encouraging for others as well. Now, what about emotions conjured in the viewer? I think that, art is strange, and there's a lot of thought in the community right now that seems to indicate that art isn't necessarily done for an audience, but I kind of disagree. Not fundamentally, but I think that that's a little limiting. Art, by its nature, is for viewing if you're working in tangible physical artworks like I'm talking about here, not music or culinary arts or things like that. And it is something that seems to reach its zenith when it is shared with other people. Is there artwork that can be done just for you? Yes, I was just talking about some of that. But I think that For most art, it reaches its full purpose when it is shared with other people. But this is probably the most difficult of these categories to understand and explain. Trying to talk about what happens from the hands of an artist to the pieces itself hanging in a gallery or a museum wall to the eyes of some random person observing it, well, I'm not sure I would get very far trying to break that entire thing down. However, this is one of the most wonderful and beautiful things about art. This is the reason I often encourage people to make things, even if they never get a chance to make money doing it, even if it's only for themselves. You never know when some piece of art is going to be exactly what some other person needs in that moment. And this is why I think it is beneficial to share your artwork. Though ironically, sometimes it's not best to share it with the people close to you. As many of you know, we get weird reactions sometimes from those that are close to us. But if you are able to share sometimes anonymously online and you won't compare yourself to other people, it can be a really interesting experience. And the thing is that this has nothing to do with subject matter. The piece that you're making isn't 100% tied to the subject that was explained within it. It has little to do with skill. There are plenty of postmodern art pieces that are non-representational that actually depict nothing in particular, and yet they mean a great deal to the right person. Now, sometimes this is done specifically as well. This is the actual intent of the artist too, like I mentioned earlier. So you think about Mark Rothko. This is an artist from the early 1900s. Well, I mean, he died in 1970, but he worked in kind of the early 1900s. And he worked on massive canvases, huge, enormous things. I think some of them were like 4 by 8 feet. And frequently they would be a single field of color, or perhaps one color melting into another, or some pretty non-representational things. He wasn't trying to like represent an abstract version of a house or an emotional scene. These were colors, specifically tailored toward particular emotional reactions, but colors nonetheless. And his express purpose was to elicit emotion in the viewers who saw his artwork. And this sounds very strange. I remember showing these pieces to middle school students many, many times. It was part of our 8th grade curriculum in the school that I worked at. And frequently students would look at these and just go, I don't get it. Like, it's a giant painting of red with some yellow on the fringes. Why would anybody care about this? And especially on the heels of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which are, in some eyes, the most beautiful artwork humanity has ever produced. Then you get to this stuff, to the non-representational stuff, and it seems so strange. And it seems strange to most people. And maybe it is. Art is often experimental and kind of weird. But his purpose was to elicit specific emotions with these giant fields of color. He would study psychology and human understanding and try to create these things that would hit people in just the right way. And oddly, there are many, many reports of people who would go in to see these pieces in galleries and museums, who would look at them and maybe walk away and feel nothing. And then the next person would walk up and just break into tears, start crying, emotionally overwhelmed by something intrinsic to this piece. Sometimes they would be laughing fits, but there were enough reports of people having these highly emotional responses to Mark Rothko's work. Very, very strange. This is what his purpose was. And in fact, part of the reason he made the painting so large is that you could walk up to them and it would absorb your entire vision. Your entire peripheral vision would be consumed by the colors that he had put up on that canvas. This is a really interesting thing and perhaps an odd way of doing this. In fact, most of the time, artwork is a little bit more upfront about what it's trying to communicate. Think about political cartoons, right? They're not very shy about what they're showing. You don't have to sit there and decipher things. Think about the cartoons that maybe you read in the Sunday comics when you were little, if you're my age, or any of the comics that you read online now. They're not shy about what they're trying to communicate. They're not trying to hold anything back. Sometimes artwork is like that. Artwork seeks to communicate a specific thing or get you to feel a particular emotion. I used to love reading the comics every day that I got the chance. I would get home from school, and after eating my 4 bowls of cereal, or while I was eating them, I would gather up the newspaper and I would read through the comics. When I was little, some of them didn't make sense to me, but there was always a couple that were really entertaining, like Zitz and Foxtrot and Baby Blues. I'm trying to think of some others. Calvin and Hobbes wasn't in the comics when I did that, but I grew up with all those. They are usually there to elicit an emotional reaction. The emotion is humor. They're trying to make you laugh. And sometimes that's how art is built. Art can be very simple and have this lovely aspect where it's just trying to make your day a little bit better. But I also think about pieces like Guernica by Picasso, and it is a tormented, tragic painting. It is indicating what happened to his homeland in the Basque region of Spain, and it was obliterated in combat. And so this piece, which at first looks like this random, jumbled mess of shapes and fragmented people and horses, looks like just silly. And when you know the history behind it, and perhaps even before you do, there's something unsettling about the work. The more you look at it, the more you know about it, the more disturbing it becomes. This is the fragmentation of someone's life, and they are displaying it in front of us. And I can feel pieces of that. We're almost 100 years later, or close to 100 years later. I'd have to look that up, but it is a very long temporal distance between me and Picasso, and yet I am able to perceive emotion that he intended in that piece. But sometimes it's not that specific. Sometimes it's just an emotion, not a particular thought. And sometimes it's not even what the artist intended, and it's something that we simply pull out of that. I go back to Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and I think about the emotion that I think he meant to embed within those pieces. And yet they communicate so much more to us now. There is a tragedy to his work, and it can sometimes remind us that it's always worth checking in with our friends, checking in with the people in our lives who are struggling, giving them the time of day, giving them an ear for whatever they're struggling with. The piece Starry Night is so beautiful, and yet there is a solemn note to it. The focus is so strange with the cypress tree in the foreground and then this swirling stuff in the background. It's named Starry Night, not cypress tree, not the name of whatever potentially Tuscan town is represented down below. There's something there, something perhaps that he intended and perhaps that he didn't, and we still have the ability to pull things out of that. In fact, many of his contemporaries, the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, were trying to simply capture an emotion in each painting. In fact, Monet, who did Sunrise Impression, the piece that Impressionism is named after, was made fun of by a lot of his contemporaries. They said, this isn't even a painting, it's an impression of a painting. It's a sketch. And his goal was not to do what everyone else had done prior. His goal was to represent that single moment. I've often heard chefs talk about when you make an apple dessert or a peach dessert, if it tastes less like an apple or less like a peach than just simply eating that fruit, then there's no point. That peach dessert must be more peach than peach. And that was the goal of the Impressionists, to make a painting that was more sunrise than experiencing sunrise yourself. That was more Starry Night than actually being there. That's why the stars and the constellations move in these patterns. It's romantic in a way. It's intriguing, and it catches us. It tugs at our heart. And that was the goal behind so many of those pieces. Maybe it was to elicit a specific reaction, and sometimes it was just to elicit emotion. I think of the painting The Song of the Lark, painted in 1884 by Jules Breton. I think it's a Frenchman, so I'm probably mispronouncing that. This is a beautiful painting. You might know that name, The Song of the Lark, from Willa Cather's book, which was inspired by the name of that painting as well. But I am reminded of a more recent thing. Bill Murray, a widely respected comedian, has said on multiple occasions that this painting saved his life. He walked into the museum that housed it after having a terrible day or terrible week, a low point in his career, and he looked at this painting of this peasant woman looking out over the plains, the sun just beginning to rise, a sickle in her hand, and there's this sense of she will continue. She is resilient. She is stubborn. Maybe she's inspired. Maybe life is incredibly difficult for her, but she is going to keep pushing on. And as Bill Murray said, if she can keep going, so can I. Now, was this the actual intention of that artist? I don't think so. You could do a little bit more research on your own, but the limited research that I've done seems to imply that the way that this painting was received by Americans was very, very different than it was by Europeans. That there's a sense of the pioneer spirit, of freedom, of stubbornness and resilience that comes out to the American populace. Though a lot of my work is not sophisticated in any comparison to these kinds of pieces, a lot of the stuff that I do with the eldritch horrors and the monsters is, I think, my way of sifting through all the pieces of our human perception of things. We often create monsters out of things we don't understand, and we are primed to be fearful. And I like playing with the idea that you can have these monstrosities, and maybe they are evil, maybe they are terrible, but maybe not. Some of the ones that I represent in my works are scary and should inspire fear, but many others are just beings so different from the viewer or audience member that they have to be perceived in a different manner. They have to be thought about. I think about how we might be perceived if we were to go talk to a sentient race that was smaller than us, that had far less power than we did. Would they be fearful of us? Probably. I'd be fearful of us, especially if I understood any amount of human history as whatever this other being was. But that's something that I like to explore in my work. This idea of we are so quick to judge as humans. It's one of the most human things you can possibly do, is to form a judgment about something. It's not usually bad. You form judgments about the fruits and vegetables that you like and don't like, about which path of driving somewhere is safer or more hospitable to you. But we do this with everything, and invariably we do it in ways where we probably need to take a moment and evaluate a little bit further. And that's one random emotional aspect that I try to embed in my work. And I don't know if it's picked up by anyone, but it matters for me. And I think that the pieces do resonate with people in some capacity. Recently, I've started doing works like this that are far more whimsical. These, for me, attach to a childhood that is now long past, but I'm kind of trying to dredge up as much as I can because it was a pretty awesome time for me. And there's this innate curiosity and love of exploring and slamming things together and seeing what works that is starting to come out in my pieces. So stay tuned and let me know if in the future you are picking up on any of those aspects. And I'd love to know what you get, if there is any emotional things that come out from looking at my artwork. Well, my thoughts, I think I've kind of covered them. I want to, at the end of these podcasts now, give myself a time to discuss kind of the unscripted ramblings of whatever my thoughts might be on this topic. This is interesting for me, though, because I'm not a particularly emotional person. And that makes a topic like this a little interesting because I'm riffing off a lot of what I know from art history and a lot of my students rather than just myself. Though I often find that the more I explore, I just find that my emotion comes out in different ways. So my emotions very seldom drive my artwork. I work on artwork far more mechanically. It's something that I enjoy doing and needs to be done because I'm a worse person if I don't create, but I don't get inspired often and sit down and work in this rush of excitement and emotion. In fact, I don't feel excitement very often. I don't like surprises. I like the calm. My dad will often ask me like, hey, how are you doing? Are you happy? And I've replied for years that like, no, I'm not happy, but happy is not my goal. Contentment is my goal. I want to be relaxed and chill in that moment. And that might sound strange to some of you, and I'm sure others will just be like, yes, I am exactly the same. But emotions still play a role in my artwork, even though I'm not a particularly emotional person. And I think that this is probably the case for almost all artists. For me, the strongest emotion is nostalgia, like I mentioned earlier. When I look back at old artwork, when I engage in new artwork that somehow is connected to old stuff that I was interested in, I am naturally pulled back into the same thoughts and feelings I had as a younger kid. And that's a really strong thing for me. I enjoy that, though, like this morning on my drive home, I was hit by a wave of sadness because I was thinking about some things that happened and transpired a couple years back. And sometimes that's what happens. Art can be a beautiful tool to attach you to the good times and the bad times, to remember in the moment what you ought to be thankful for. And sometimes it's just a tool to work through my overwhelm when I'm burnt out or I'm tired. It can be beneficial to me to sit down and work on things. So, yeah. Well, thanks for being here. And if you've listened all the way to the end, thank you for listening to all these rambles. I'm really curious about your thoughts. I'd love to hear about them in the comments below, and it might be comforting to someone else to hear about that as well. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen now. If you want to check out my Patreon, it's linked below. It gives you access to some video content only for patrons, to updates about what's happening in my life here in the studio, the work that I'm putting down, all those kinds of things, the ability to vote on upcoming content, and it also just gives you the ability to support what I do here at the channel. The Discord server is linked down there too. It's totally free. There's no hoops to jump through or anything like that. But it's a little community where you can talk to other artists, share your work, get some critique on things, and I think it's a beautiful little community. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.